My name is Jason J. Rock Houston, and you're listening to Cataclysm Magazine. We can be found on the web at www.cataclysm.com. And today our special guest is director Bob Nalbandian. And Bob, you directed this film I had the privilege of watching last night called Bay Area Godfathers. And let's talk a little bit about the film. Now, what I got out of the film is obviously it's about the Bay Area thrash scene, but you know what I really dug about the film is before you really get into the thrash scene, you talk about like you know, the other music scene that kind of came before. You're talking about, okay, we had you know, people like Janis Joplin and you know, even Journey, and you even mentioned Montrose at the beginning. So I dug kind of how you guys start off talking about other music scenes and how it morphed into the thrash scene. So I was curious, you know, talk a little bit about your decision to make this film.
Well, yeah, you know, it's funny how people automatically say, you know, the Bay Area thrash scene, since the thrash metal music was, you know, kind of a staple of the Bay Area. But this documentary is just about the Bay Area music scene.
Yeah, that's kind of what I got out of it.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's what it was always intended to be. You know, obviously the thrash played a huge major role, and of course we interviewed tons of major thrash bands from that era, you know, including, you know, Lars from Metallica, and, but also, you know, guys from Testament, Death Angel, you know, other artists that, you know, power metal kind of bands, guys from Vicious Rumors and that kind of stuff, and then a lot of the LA guys, Slayer and Megadeth, artists from all sorts of thrash, but we wanted to include, you know, the whole scene. And you know, if you've seen the Inside Metal series, this is actually our fourth movie in the Inside Metal series. We did 3 previous titles based on the LA scene, which was the pioneers of LA hard rock and metal. LA metal scene explodes, and the rise of LA thrash metal. This movie, Bay Area Godfathers, which is also a 2-part movie. Part 2 will be coming out the beginning of the new year. All the DVD titles are 2-part movies. This is kind of combines everything into one 2-part movie. So we start from the beginning. We kind of touch on how it evolved from the 60s era and the Summer of Love. And, you know, as you mentioned, Janis Joplin and all those, you know, from Journey to Montrose, and then leading to Y&T, that really kind of started the hard rock metal scene. You know, that was, you know, a band that really was noted as really spawning that. And they started like in '74. A lot of people think they were just an '80s hair metal band.
Oh yeah, you know, actually, but they're known as Y&T, but they started out as Yesterday and Today. And I gotta say, I gotta give you credit for including Y&T because, like you said, you know, when I heard about the film and I saw the title, I thought naturally it's gonna be about the Bay Area thrash scene. And I loved seeing like Dave McKenney. He was talking about how, you know, him and the guys in Y&T, they used to go and see the metal bands. They used to go hang out with the punk guys, and they were everybody on the scene kind of got along, and they weren't putting each other down. They were all in it together. You know, they go and check each other's shows out.
Yeah, it's kind of how the Bay Area was. It was apparently, you know, I wasn't around in the Bay Area scene that time. I grew up in LA, but from, you know, many people I talked to, my producers, John Stranansky and Danny Shipman from Reality Check TV, they kind of co-produced the movie with me, and I directed, and it, you know, they gave me a lot of insight as to the Bay Area scene as well. You know, I mean, I knew well about the scene. I had, you know, people like Ron Quintana and John Stranansky I was pen pals with back in the early 80s, so I was very familiar with all these bands, including the more underground bands, you know, the bands we include like the Anvil Chorus and Stone Vengeance and Damage. You know, I knew of all these bands, so I had a pretty good concept of what the entire scene, not just thrash, but the whole hard rock and metal scene, starting, like as you say, with the Yesterday and Today's, and, you know, we had Mike Varney, who was kind of one of the kingpins of the Bay Area scene as far as getting it started. He started the first label, the first all metal label really in the U.S. He had Shrapnel Records prior to Metal Blade, and you know, prior to Megaforce and prior to Combat and all that, and he started with the U.S. metal albums, which kind of showcased a lot of the Bay Area bands. Of course, his whole emphasis was on the guitar playing, but it was more, of a hard rock. Again, this was thrash metal, so it showed more of a progressive hard rock, and that's kind of how the Bay Area started out. Very progressive. You listen to bands like early Journey, and bands like that, and even early Santana had a very progressive roots, and so yeah, it's kind of interesting how it did evolve into Y&T, and then it evolved into kind of the thrash metal capital. So it's an interesting story, and we wanted to tell that whole story about it.
Yeah, and at this point, Y&T's been around so long. I mean, they're legendary in their own right, and 2 or 3 of the band members have passed away over the years. But you got to have respect that they're still doing what they do.
Dave Metichetti's great, and he still sounds amazing. I saw him pretty recently, and unfortunately, the remaining 3 original band members all passed away, and Dave Menichetti had kept the legacy alive. He kept it going, and he still keeps it going, and he still sounds amazing. He's got a great band behind him. They do all the Yesterday and Today classics from songs off even off the first album, and Struck Down. They'll occasionally play songs off that and off the Earthshaker album, and through the whole history of Yesterday and Today, and going into Y&T. So I totally give him props, and I love the fact that he's still going at it.
And what I love about a guy like him, he's a triple threat. I mean, he's a great lead singer, a great guitar player, great songwriter. He's one of those guys that can do it all.
Yeah, absolutely. People like that. I mean, a lot of people complain, it's only one original member, but it was like, Dave Menichetti really is Y&T, and that's no disrespect to the original guys, to Joey Alves or Phil Kennemore or Leonard Hayes. I mean, they were all a unit, fantastic. But as you said, he was the singer, guitarist, and main songwriter. And it's just like saying Dave Mustaine. Dave Mustaine could really get any members of the band and still call it Megadeth, because essentially Dave Mustaine is Megadeth. He formed the band, he writes the songs, he's a singer, guitarist. So Dave Menichetti's kind of that kind of thing. So I'm kind of sick of people saying, "Oh man, it's not the same. It's like it's not the original guys." It's like, well, all the other original guys are passed away.
Yeah, what do you want? What do you want?
What do you expect for him to give it up? He still sounds fucking great.
Yeah.
He still sings amazing. His voice hasn't, at his age, so many singers that you hear can't sing anymore, but he still sounds amazing. So, God bless him. I love the fact that he's still going out there and killing it.
And what I loved about your film too is, like you said, it touched on the whole, not just the whole San Francisco scene, but I love the fact that you get into other areas. Like, for example, you almost like tell Mike Varney's story. I'm aware of who Mike Varney is, that he's helped discover a lot of great guitar players, like you said. He had that label Shrapnel. Now, what I wasn't aware about Mike Varney, I wasn't aware of it. He was a guitar player himself, and he had a career for a while himself, and then he decided, I'm going to instead stay at home. I'm going to start my own label. I'm going to help other people, get into the business.
Yeah, that was a surprise. I even learned a lot from the movie, but that was a surprise to many people. People don't realize Varney used to play in a punk band called the Nuns in the late 70s, who were a pretty popular band in the Bay Area, real popular actually. And it's kind of funny, him being this guitar shredder kind of guy that brought in the likes of brought over Yngwie Malmsteen and catapulted the careers of Jason Becker, Marty Friedman, Paul Gilbert, all these guys. That he was originally a punk rock dude in a punk rock band. So it's a unique history, and we wanted to give that whole history about the Bay Area, because punk and kind of like LA, it kind of all intertwined. You had the punk, new wave, and hard rock bands playing together. Van Halen would play with a lot of the punk bands back in the club days with the Weirdos and whatever, and that was just kind of the way it was. This is before there was a so-called metal scene that kind of exploded, and so a lot of the clubs, they just put in bands that would draw, and it was an interesting era, and I think we really kind of tell the story of all the genres of hard rock and metal during the 80s.
And of course, I can't talk about the film without talking a little bit about Metallica. And the interesting thing is you showed in your film, but a lot of people forget about, is Metallica is not originally from San Francisco, as many people think. They got their start in Los Angeles, but for whatever reason, they did not get a lot of love in Los Angeles. And it was, from what I understand, Cliff Burton telling the other guys, "Hey, why don't you guys move up to Northern California, where I'm from, and that's where they started to get a lot of love.
Yeah, well, they started playing early on in the Bay Area, but they were a local LA band. Lars grew up in Newport. I'm from Huntington Beach originally, Orange County, so I actually knew Lars before he formed Metallica.
Oh, wow.
I saw their very first show. I saw several of their shows in LA. This is back when Dave Mustaine and Ron McGovney were in the band. And they would go up to San Francisco every now and again, and that's, kind of when they spotted Cliff Burton. And, they got a lot more respect in the Bay Area than they did in LA, because the Bay Area kind of had that threat. You had a lot of support with, Ron Quintana's station KUSI. KUSF. Ron Quintana and Ian Callan and Ron had Metal Mania. John Stranansky had Metal Rendezvous. There were a lot of fanzines and college radio that really pushed the underground thrash bands and new wave of British heavy metal. I mean, it wasn't even called thrash back then. But they would play the demo tapes. They would play the early Metallica demos, and that really garnered them a lot of respect. So it was the obvious choice when Cliff said, "Hey, if you want me in the band, you got to move up there." They're like, "Yeah." That's a no-brainer for them. And but yeah, they were definitely an LA band, and it's funny because when people talk about the Big Four, three of the Big Four actually started in Los Angeles. Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth, or they were bred in Los Angeles. And it's funny how people consider the Bay Area the thrash metal capital, but the reason being is that's where really that music really thrived. And not only Metallica, but we interview Dave Lombardo from Slayer and the original Slayer manager Stephen Craig, and David Ellison from Megadeth, and they all say, even Rocky from Suicidal, they said that was we would go up to the Bay Area constantly, and that's where we got a lot more respect. And in Suicidal's case, they were actually banned from LA for 5 years, actually banned from playing LA. But a lot of the other bands, they would take the 8-hour trip or whatever up to San Francisco and play the Stone or Ruthie's Inn, and it was a whole different scene than the LA scene at that time.
And another thing I learned from your film, but all these years of being a metal fan, I'd never even heard this. I was shocked to hear Lars Ulrich. I heard somebody was talking about he almost tried out for Metal Church. I thought, wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, I had kind of heard about that. It was Ron Quintana who mentioned that, and I had heard about that. I think that Ron had mentioned that to me before, and we had talked about. I didn't realize at that time, and I do kind of recall, because Lars had just started out on the drums. When he started with Metallica, he was not a seasoned drummer. He was a beginning drummer, and really Dave Mustaine was the only real seasoned player. He had a band called Panic back then, and from Huntington Beach in Orange County, and actually James was in a band called Leather Charm too. So they were actually out kind of gigging, and but Lars and the original bass player Ron McGovney did not have that much experience as a musician. So it's not uncommon that that when Ron talks about Metal Church, he was going to try to get him an audition for Metal Church, but Lars wasn't quite ready.
It's funny you say that, because I've heard James over years talk in interviews saying where when he first met Lars Ulrich, he says, I didn't hook up with that guy because I thought he was the most talented drummer in the world. He said he just had one bass drum. He could barely play. He had to teach himself over years to play, but he said, I hooked up with him because he had connections in the metal community. In my greed to kind of get ahead, Lars knew this guy that had a record company, and I thought, okay, he's got connections, so I'm going to do something with this guy, Yeah,
that's true. That, Lars was able to get, Brian Slagle was just starting, Slagle had a fanzine too called New Heavy Metal Review back then. And he just, before he even thought about forming a record label, he just thought about putting a compilation album of metal bands. And it was really inspired by, what Mike Varney did with US Metal, and a lot of really inspired by the new wave of British heavy metal compilations like Metal for Mothers and Brute Force. And that was kind of the cool thing, is to have a metal compilation record, because this is before metal was really big. You didn't have bands signing deals at that time. So, Brian Slagle started the Metal Massacre album and had Metallica on before they were even a band, because him and his Brian's partner, John Cornarins, was the original partner in Metal Blade with Brian Slagle. They were friends with Lars, and they said, "Well, you got a slot on the record." And Lars is kind of like, "Oh, they don't even know I don't even have a band yet." But then he called up James, and James was like, "Oh, I have a chance to be on a record." Because back then, being on a record, even a compilation record, that was a big deal. You didn't, I mean, nowadays anyone could put, learn a CD, record in their house, and do that. Back in the early '80s, I mean, if you had vinyl out, that was a big thing. So, obviously that's the way Lars kind of lured in James and eventually Dave Mustaine and formed Metallica.
Yeah, and the film shows too how organic the scene was. I mean, it was nothing like, if you remember in the early '90s when grunge started to explode everywhere. All of a sudden they started dropping all the established bands and went out and they were signing nothing but grunge, and then it was kind of like cookie cutter. Every band was sound, but this thrash scene and the scene in San Francisco was more organic. That a lot of those bands started getting signed in the '80s, but they weren't all sounding like each other. They each had their own identity.
Yeah, it was very pure. I mean, a lot of these bands, obviously, they were influenced by each other. I mean, all the bands, weren't influenced by Metallica when they started, but they were all, and not just the San Francisco bands, but a lot of the, thrash bands coming from LA and other areas of the US, they were all inspired by the new wave of British heavy metal. Particularly Motorhead was a huge inspiration on the speed and heaviness, and of course bands like Saxon and Iron Maiden, when the first couple Iron Maiden records came out, and even more underground new wave of British heavy metal bands, or at least underground here in the States, bands like Angel Witch and Tigers of Pantang and Holocaust. I mean, those were all, and of course the European bands like Accept, when Restless and Wild came out with Fast as a Shark, which is one of the first thrash songs, of Raven from England, Merciful Fate when they put out their first EP. Those were huge influences in thrash metal, I think way more so than punk rock was, and everyone was inspired by that, including Lars. That was his biggest inspiration. So that all kind of came across there. But you're right. It was a very pure thing. So people were influenced by these bands, but they didn't have that cookie cutter mentality. But again, this is before the business. These bands were putting out demo tapes. They weren't signing major,
deals,
$200,000 record deals, where it was a business, where the labels kind of said, sound like this, use this producer, have this songwriter. This was totally pure, and bands did their own thing. They went in their own studio, put up a few dollars, and recorded a cheap demo, and that's the way it was back then. And I think it is a characteristic. It really shows, the rawness and just the
honesty. Go
ahead.
The honesty of the music. Like writing songs. Yeah. These guys were writing songs about, what they were living at the time. They, like you said, they didn't have an established songwriter. Okay, he's going to go write you a radio hit. This was from within the band. They did it themselves,
Definitely, yeah. And, it really paid off for a lot of those bands. I mean, you look at a lot of the Bay Area, the Bay Area thrash bands in particular, some of them are bigger today than they've been back in the 80s, You can't really say the same for a lot of, the 80s hair metal bands and such. But when it comes to thrash, and all these bands are still going, Testament, Death Angel, of course, Metallica, they're going stronger than ever. Violence is back, and so still have a huge following, worldwide. So it hasn't died down at all. When people say that the metal scene has died, it really, they're just not looking deep into it, because maybe as far as the newer bands, there's not nearly as much as obviously, but some of these old bands that from the 80s, like I said, they're bigger now than they were back then. So.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, like just now and in the film, about the new wave of British heavy metal, all the European bands that the American bands were influenced. I really love that you showcase that, because I mean, you give some love to bands like Tigers of Pantang. You mentioned obviously Iron Maiden, Def Leppard. Now, when you hear Def Leppard was part of a new wave of British heavy metal, because Def Leppard has turned into such a commercial hard rock band, people are surprised to hear they were part of a new wave British heavy metal. But if you go back and you listen to those first two Def Leppard albums, I mean, they were almost full-blown on metal.
Oh yeah. The first album was classic, On Through the Night. And they were one of the originals. I think they were one of the first bands, new wave British heavy metal bands, signed to America on a major label. They kind of made the breakthrough in America, and then came Iron Maiden, Saxon, of course, Motorhead. I think Motorhead's first American release, although they were around since the mid-'70s, their first American release was Ace of Spades in 1980. But that's kind of when the band started coming over. Tigers of Pantang had Wildcats. So the Def Leppard were very instrumental in that new wave of British heavy metal sound back in the early days. But then they kind of turned from Pyromania on. They kind of turned into the hair metal band, and then they inspired the LA hair metal movement.
Yeah, and you go back to early Iron Maiden, especially those first two albums with Paul Di'Anno. Everybody thinks of Maiden as a metal band, but if you listen to those first two albums, they were almost they had a real punk element because of the way Paul Di'Anno sang.
Don't tell Steve Harris that; he'll be upset.
Okay.
he gets annoyed when people say, "Oh, but you guys started out punk." Steve Harris was always a big progressive guy, prog metal guy.
Oh, okay.
Definitely, you can't deny the punk influence that Paul Di'Anno brought to Iron Maiden. I mean, you listen to Iron Maiden musically; it's very heavy. I mean, it's a lot heavier than prog bands like Yes or Genesis or Jethro Tull. But you definitely hear that prog influence in Iron Maiden's music and the musicianship and just the way the songs are structured. But with Di'Anno's rough edge vocals and his attitude and his look, it was very punk rock at that time, and I think that's what made Maiden so cool in those early days. It really just stood out. Paul Di'Anno with his spiked short hair and the studded wristbands and that raunchy kind of voice that he had. It was definitely a great combination that just was made. Maiden were just such an original band at that time. No one was really doing
anything like that
style in such a heavy metal fashion. So absolutely.
And I also got to bring up Megadeth because, in fact, if there wasn't a Metallica, there'd never be Megadeth. And what I love about Megadeth is I've heard Dave Mustaine talk over years about when he originally put the band together, he had no intention of being the lead singer. He was going to get another lead singer. He had no idea that he could really sing. It kind of just fell into it because he'd auditioned a couple guys, and he was like, I can't get anybody to perform my songs the way I hear them in my head. And he kind of found out accidentally that people were telling, hey, Dave, you're not a bad singer. Why don't you just do it? And if it wouldn't have been for forming Megadeth, Dave Mustaine never may become a lead singer.
Yeah. Well, you can say the same for James Hetfield. When Metallica started, James was not happy being a singer. At first, he was just singing and not playing guitar because they needed a singer, and James didn't really. James was very shy, and he wasn't really a front man, so to speak. And he wasn't really too competent with his voice. I mean, if you listen to those early Metallica demos, he tries to sing high a lot. It's a whole different sound. So he started as a singer, and then he just wanted to play guitar. And they were looking. Metallica were looking for singers. They were trying to get John Bush from Armored Saint to sing with them because they weren't really. James was not really happy and confident as being a vocalist guitar player, but obviously, he turned into this amazing vocalist guitar player frontman. That just kind of ruled the metal world. But back in those days, he didn't really have the confidence to be
but he does now.
To play guitar in a thrash metal band, whether you're playing rhythm or lead, to play guitar and sing at the same time, that's quite a task.
Oh yeah.
To do so. So I think a lot of bands kind of had that problem.
And, I love the fact too in the film you don't just interview the bands and musicians. You feature other people like that were part of the scene. For example, I love learning about. You never think of so much would go into like Metal Monday and what that would become. And all the exposure these bands would get because of somebody having an idea for Metal Monday.
Yeah, I mean, that was important. And we've done that in the whole Inside Metal series with all the LA metal titles. We just don't, it's about the scene, not, because a lot of people go, oh, well, you feature bands, Megadeth and Slayer and these bands aren't from San Francisco. I said, no, they talk about the scene, about when they came up to San Francisco for the first time. So, and being a part of the scene, some of these promoters and people like Ron Quintana and John Cernansky, the people that did the magazines and the record store owners, Bill Burkhardt, who sadly passed away just after we did the interview with him.
Oh, wow. wow.
Shortly after, we got the last interview at Bill Party at the Record Exchange, which was a huge component in the San Francisco Bay Area metal scene, as well as the Record Vault in San Francisco. We interviewed Bob Gamber, and Jimmy Arsenault, who is a big promoter. He promoted the Omni and all that. So it's important to get all those kind of people, as well as, like you said, the labels, Mike Varney and people like Brian Brinkerhoff. So it's not just an artist point of view. We got a lot of the players, the pivotal players that helped to create that scene. Yeah.
And it's important you include those people, because people watching the film may be a lot younger than you and me, Bob, and they may not even realize what an experience of going to a record store used to be. I'll tell you, I'm an old school guy. I miss that. I wish somebody would have an idea to, open up a record store or something like that. I mean, because it's so funny. I live in Long Beach, California.
Right on.
And you'd think, Los Angeles area, there'd be a ton of record stores. I mean, I get most of my music these days either through, the bands I listen to, their websites, or Amazon. And because unless I want to go down to a local Target and get the Beach Boys' greatest hits, that's your selection's somewhat limited,
Yeah, well, you're so right, man. God, I remember back in the day, and they, like I said, I grew up in Huntington Beach, and we used to go up to Long Beach. There was this store called Zed Records.
Oh, yeah.
It was kind of a punk rock store, but they got all the British imports in. So they would carry a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal stuff. So we would drive up there from Huntington, take a half hour or so just to go by road. We would drive 60 miles up to Oz Records in the valley, in Woodland Hills, the deep valley from Orange County, over an hour drive, just to go record store shopping. That's where Brian Slagle was working.
Oh, wow.
He managed Oz Records before he started Metal Blade. So, the record stores and the Bay Area, I think Steve Zuzza and Tom Hunting from Exodus, they were talking about, the Record Vault being, and the Record Exchange being all heavy metal. It was a record store that was able to survive on just selling heavy metal records and heavy metal bands on vinyl. So, that shows how big that scene was and how big the record stores were.
I mean, and I dare say, I dare say there still is a scene, because if somebody would do something like that, I mean, even just for metalheads, have a hangout. I mean, I used to love to go hang out at local Tower Records, because kind of very much like you're saying, they had such a huge selection. You could look for hours. I remember going, and I'd be almost between paychecks planning, okay, I get paid next week. Let's see what are all the new releases coming out. What am I going to buy, And that's how it used to be. They used to have big displays. They used to have big signings. Artists would go. It used to be a wonderful thing, and I think people just are missing out on that.
Yeah, I don't know if people would still have that same experience because of the whole streaming and everything. People could just get music for free. But, there are still some record stores. I mean, here in the Bay Area, you got Rasputin and, of course, the Amoeba, and that are still able to survive. We'll see what happens after this whole COVID thing. But hopefully the record stores will survive, at least have a few of the mom-and-pop stores. And I think a lot of the cities still have a couple mom-and-pop stores still around, but they're not, they have to, a lot of them have to sell stuff on eBay and all that. They have to, they can't really survive on the store alone.
You have to really look for them and know where they are.
Yeah. So it's sad, and I think they're rebuilding aren't they going to open up a new Amoeba in Los Angeles?
I hope so, because I wasn't aware they closed it, so I don't know.
I heard they were. I don't know if
I'll have to look into that and let you know. But that's the other thing I was thinking. You could make a film on kind of the dying LA scene. It's sad because a lot of the hair metal and the rock guys over here in the 80s, they moved to Las Vegas. That's kind of becoming a music scene. It was anyways before COVID and everything.
Well, even Mike Varney and Brian Slagle, they live in Vegas. A lot of those kind of people are living in Vegas now, yeah.
And then, even some of the legendary clubs, because of COVID and all that and everything being shut down, like the Troubadour, they're fighting they don't even know if they're going to be able to stay afloat.
I heard the Troubadour closed down, and Slim's in San Francisco, which was the big, I guess one of the biggest metal venues these days that we're showcasing. Good size, metal bands, Exodus and bands like that. They closed down. So, when this whole COVID thing's over, who knows who knows what's going to be left. I'll be surprised if the Whiskey and the Roxy and, those
don't go too.
Clubs are going to stay open. Because the point is that's prime real estate there and in the Bay Area and all that. And so, I just feel bad. It sucks that people, the generation aren't going to experience what we experience, whether it be going to the clubs or going to record stores or just the scene. There is no scene anymore, and that's the scene today is online on Facebook.
You may have a film in that, Bob. You should consider it, because it's very sad. I mean, I hate to say that a lot of it is really become over politics. I mean, the governor here in California, I've seen him a couple times get on TV and make comments like he doesn't know if he's ever going to allow live concerts again as long as he's in the governor's office. He doesn't know if he's ever going to allow movies.
I don't know why people say shit like that. It's just, they don't know the future.
That's what I hate.
It's just this whole back and forth thing about I got to be against, this side. This party says they want things open, so I got to say we're never going to.
That's what I'm talking about.
Shut the fuck up. Just say we don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know what's going to happen in the future. It all depends on stuff. So I agree with you. The politics are just.
And the sad thing is, even when you get into like movies and the movie academy, I mean, they're even like, well, we don't know if we're going to have televised Academy Awards anymore. Just stupid, It's really ruining a lot of things. I mean, that's one thing I dig about some of the bands that continue to put out new music, because there's some bands that are holding off on even releasing anything this year. And in a time like this, you need to be entertained. So if somebody can go and buy a new album by their favorite band, why not,
Yeah, that's what we feel about this movie. We feel it's perfect timing for a Bay Area Godfathers to come out, and it's coming out next week, October 6th. Part 1, again, this is a two-part movie. I know you've only seen the first part. We haven't released part 2 to the press yet because we're kind of separating the two movies. Part 2 will likely be out the beginning of the new year, after the holidays.
So obvious question, Bob, is why the need for part 2? I mean, I've seen other films in the series. I loved all of them, but is it just that there was so much to talk about we couldn't get it all in one film?
Basically, when I started this, I was hired by Warren Croyle, the executive producer, and was working with Joe Floyd, a fantastic guitar player. He was a guitar player and founder of the LA band Warrior. You may remember Fighting for the Earth.
Oh, yeah.
And, they had a Warren and Joe had a studio called Silver Cloud, and Warren had been doing movies. He started a movie company, and he talked to Joe about doing an LA, kind of just basically like a LA documentary, and Joe said, we got to get Bob to direct, and then it just, to make a long story short, it evolved into this series, this Inside Metal series, and I forgot what your initial
well, I'm just saying, question. Is it, you're doing a part 2 just because there's so much?
So going back to once we started doing it, we just getting interviews left and right, because I wanted to tell the whole story. So with LA, rather than starting with when everyone thinks the metal scene really started with the Motley Crues and Rat and all that, I wanted to go before to the Van Halen era, because there were so many bands. I played the Starwood and all these, which was actually before my time. I never made it out to the Starwood, but it was such a cool era. I mean, I just remember seeing, I went to a lot of the other clubs and saw, bands like Snow and A La Carte, and Smile and Greg Leon, Invasion Stormer. I mean, there were so many bands that never got the recognition, but these bands were packing the clubs, and they kind of Quiet Riot with Randy Rhoads,
In the LA metal scene, if I remember seeing that, you had the opportunity to feature Frankie Bonelli in that, right? I think I seen him.
No, we did. Well, we asked him, but Frankie was not. He was doing. He was working on the Quiet Riot documentary at the same time.
Oh, okay, wow.
Which a lot of people saw. So I think he was real busy there. We talked to Carlos Cavazo.
Yeah.
He's in all the LA metal titles, and he really gave great perspective, because he was in the band Snow, who were one of my favorite bands back then, and then Quiet Riot. So, but to get back to your point, we interviewed so many artists, and I kept trying to edit it down, and Warren's like, dude, we need a 90-minute movie. And I would send him these rough edits of 4 hours and stuff, and he goes, dude, this isn't going to work. We have to make it into a 90-minute movie to get it on, on the digital formats and this and that. And then, finally he just said, dude, why don't you just make a 2-part movie? And I'm like, fuck. Because I kept saying, we can't make it. If I cut this into one 90-minute movie, the story is not going to be complete. We have to make it complete. And that's when he said, make it into a 2-part series. So we just did that with every title, from the pioneers to LA Metal Explodes to Rise of LA Thrash Metal to this new movie, Bay Area Godfathers. They're all two-part movies.
And before, and you can tell I talk to you all day, Bob, because I'm so into metal and all this. But before we wrap this up, I got to also make two great points that I loved about Bay Area Godfathers. I love the fact too that you kind of show at the time when the scene was going on back in the day. How people would create their own little fanzines and used to have these great rock magazines. I mean, for example, you got John and Bill Hale that ran Metal Renaissance together, and those were great magazines. I mean, when I was growing up, I used to love to go get Circus Magazine. They used to have Metal Edge, Hit Parader, all that, and that is an art form that is sadly, because of the internet and a lot of other reasons, just kind of vanished.
Yeah, it was here. Well, that's how I started doing a fanzine. I had a fanzine called The Headbanger, and I started in 1982 with my first issue. At the same time, Metal Rendezvous, John Stranansky and Bill Hale started their magazine, and Ron Quintana was just ahead of us with Metal Mania. And as I said, Brian Slagle had the New Heavy Metal Review, which was one of the originals. And there were magazines like Kick-Ass Monthly from New York. And it was a big thing, man. And that was all when tape trading and demos and, trading and, college radio and fanzines. That was the only way to expose these metal bands, especially the more underground metal bands. And even bands like Maiden, who were underground at that time, they weren't getting the love and the Hit Paraders and Circus in the early 80s. I mean, not until maybe Number of the Beast came out. It was all the metal fanzines, and that's was such an important thing back then.
And then like even a band like Metallica, eventually you would see them in a Circus magazine once they became popular. But it was those early fanzines that helped to break the band.
Absolutely, man. Metallica, all those thrash bands, they owe it to the fanzines. And you did have Kerrang in England. That was kind of a major British magazine that was exposing Metallica and a lot of the thrash bands and stuff. And there's Metal Forces from England and Aardschok from Holland, Anfer from France. So there were the European magazines were a lot more acceptable to the LA and San Francisco and just the U.S. metal bands in general.
It's funny. It's funny you say that because it's still quite a popular thing. Like rock magazines and that. In Europe, that's why you still got like Kerrang, and I know they have a great classic rock magazine, but you have to pay $20 for it. But I will say, if you're going to pay $20 for something like that, at least it's a nice quality. They do a good job of putting it together,
Yeah, it's a beautiful magazine. I mean, our classic rock magazine is a lot of the old guys from Kerrang are writing for there, as well as another great magazine, which one of my favorites out of Europe, Rock Candy, which is also Derek Oliver from Kerrang, and a lot of the old Kerrang guys write for that magazine. So they're keeping the legacy going. In Europe, they could do that. They can still do the print magazines that people. I think. But even back in the day, that was always a bigger thing. The print magazines were always a big thing in England and Europe. And in the U.S., it was always all radio.
And that's pre-internet. Back in the day, I remember going to get like Circus magazine, and I'd be reading about when Kiss or Queen was going to come to town, and you'd have no idea. You might be buying the magazine 2-3 months after the interview's been done, and you're reading about maybe some songs they played in the concert, but you had no idea that what was in the set list, or you had no idea what happened at the show last night. It was nothing like it is today. You be going to pick up these magazines to read about your favorite bands, and I'll find out, it'll tell you, the new album's coming out such and such a date,
Well, that's what made it so exciting going to see a concert back then, is you didn't know. Nowadays, you could preview the concert. You get tickets to say, AC/DC or whatever. Yeah. You could just go on YouTube and preview the whole concert the night before, and it really kind of sucks. It brings down the whole surprise element, of what you're going to expect. And I agree. I mean, that's what made the concert experience so special.
And fans are so fickle these days. Like you said, they go online. I didn't like the way the singer sang last night, so I'm not going to go see them. Or they had a sucky show or whatever. Or instead of buying the whole album, I'll just buy the latest single. I don't want to spend my money on the whole album. That's kind of a sad state of way a lot of the fans are these days.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
And I gotta say that what I really loved about the film too was, like, you could have made a film where you just like interviewed and featured like mainstream bands. I love the fact that you also got bands like Vicious Rumors, Suicidal Tendencies in there. I mean, Vicious Rumors, even Death Angel. These are bands that have been around for years. They're starting to kind of, get a little bit more airplay and attention. But, bands like I said, especially like Suicidal, I'm surprised they weren't bigger. I don't know why they weren't, but at least they're getting some love in this film, because that's one band, for example, I think a lot of people have forgotten about.
Yeah, and that was great that we got Rocky involved in this, because they did, as I mentioned, they were banned in LA, so they were doing several shows at Ruthie's Inn up in San Francisco during the early 80s. But yeah, we always want to get, I think it's important for us to give equal time to, not just the Lars Ulrichs and the big artists, the Dave Medicettis, but also, smaller bands like Vicious Rumors, Anvil Chorus, bands that people may not know about, but they were huge during that time. Lost Rocket, they were one of the biggest Bay Area bands in the early 80s as far as their live performances and stuff goes. So a lot of these bands, that were huge back then, they, we want to bring the viewer back to that time. That's and these were the bands that were big during that time. Sure, business-wise, we could say, these bands mean nothing now. And a lot of the people, distributors and whatever, there was, at first they're like, who are these bands? especially when we did the first title, nobody knew who Snow and Paul McCartney and all these bands were. But it was important for us to showcase the true history of the scene, whether it be the Los Angeles scene or the Bay Area, San Francisco scene. I mean,
but like even like with the LA scene, for example, in the film where you guys talk about the LA bands, I mean, you even featured some bands that, like you said, came close to make, like if anybody was from LA, or like Snow, okay, if you're a Quiet Riot fan, okay, that's the band Carlos Cavazo was in before Quiet Riot. And if you know anything about Quiet Riot's history, the original lineup featured Randy Rhoads, and Quiet Riot sounded more like a hard rock band than a metal band back then. So I love the fact that, like in LA, there are bands like Lancia, and maybe outside of LA, not a lot of people know the band.
I remember them. Yeah, I remember that band.
Pretty Boy Floyd. But there are bands, and even in the I love the fact you featured Davey Vane. He's a guy who's been doing it for years. He never broke out in a big way, but you got to have respect for a guy like that. Man, I couldn't believe when I heard, but he produced the first Death Angel album.
Yeah, that was, and that's a funny thing, because there was always this kind of rivalry. Everyone said there was this huge hatred with the thrash bands out of the Bay Area and the glammier bands that, kill the posers and hate these guys. But in truth, they all kind of got along, and they all kind of worked together. And Davey Vane was very instrumental. He had worked with Kirk Hammett in the early days, and as you said, produced the first two Death Angel records. And they were a big, and talking to people like Jimmy Arsenault and the promoter and all that, he goes, dude, the glam scene was just as big as the thrash scene. Yeah. We would book these glam bands, and he was naming bands that I'm not even that familiar with. I heard the name, Mad Anthony and all these bands. He said they would sell out the Omni, and then the next day, we'd have Testament, and they would sell out. So everyone thinks it was just thrash metal in San Francisco, but there was a huge scene of glam bands, progressive bands, kind of traditional rock bands, more power metal bands. It was an all-around music scene.
And it was interesting watching the film that, like, a lot of these guys that are featured in the film, I never even heard. For example, that you had this guy Peter Marino, and I find out he's a singer from Cacophony. Okay, which I thought.
Cacophony, with Marty and Jason.
See, that's
and
what.
Also Le Mans.
Yeah, and see, that's what I was getting to. See, I heard of Cacophony, but I thought, that was just Jason Becker and Marty Friedman's thing, because they're kind of on the cover of the album. I had no idea that they even had a. So that's what I love about the film, kind of learning, okay, so there were more than just Marty and Jason in that band, and and I love that you're giving some exposure to some of these guys that maybe didn't get the exposure that Jason Becker or Marty got, and it's interesting because Jason Becker, as you know, anything about his story, I mean, he came, just as he was joining David Lee Roth's band, I mean, just think of the career that guy could have had, and unfortunately he became ill, but you gotta respect the guy, because I mean, if you know anything about his story, he could have just given up, but he continues to make music, and it's amazing. He does it with these computers, and even I loved because I seen the movie he made about his life.
Yeah, Not Dead Yet. If anyone listening to this hasn't seen that documentary, definitely check it out. Jason Becker, Not Dead Yet. Just such an inspirational movie. It's unbelievable.
And I got to ask you, Bob, like, were you present during the Jason Becker scenes, like when that was being filmed? And if so, what was that like? Because it's very interesting to watch. It's not his actual voice, but kind of I know from watching that Not Dead Yet, like he does it. He talks kind of with the computer and with his eyes. Very interesting. But what was that like seeing that?
Yeah, well, that was me that was there doing the interviews, and that was his mother that would translate his eye movements. He's able to communicate by the movement of his eyes because he's basically paralyzed. He can't move, for people that don't know. I've known Jason from the beginning. When he was 17, I worked with Cacophony. I was kind of acting as their manager because I was working with Marty Friedman before. In fact, incidentally, I got Marty Friedman in Megadeth after Cacophony split up because Jason had just got the David Lee Roth gig. Dean Castronova, the drummer, just got the Bad English gig. And Marty's like, dude, can you find me a gig? And that's when I hooked him up with Dave Mustaine and Megadeth. But yeah, going back, so that just shows I've known Jason for so many years, and we were great friends. He's still great friends, and when he invited me up to come out to interview him, it was just such an honor to do that, and just to have Jason be a part of this movie. Is great because the guy's the most inspirational artist I know. It's unbelievable, his story. Unbelievable because, as you say, he could have been the great. At 17, he was one of the best guitar players I had ever seen in my life, and performers too. Seeing Cacophony live, the way he performed, he moved kind of around like Steve Vai, just like this young Steve Vai. He was just absolutely amazing. Just to see what his career could have been is man, it's just such a sad story. But he's in such a good spirits, man, and that's the thing that's good about it. You can see him in the video. Oh yeah. If you when you watch the movie,
like he had a huge smile on his face. Yeah, you
can see that. Yeah.
And now maybe it's different for you because you've known him all these years. But like as you're sitting there and asking these questions, like was it weird? Like, did you have to wait for his response a little longer than you typically were, or was it just like you were having a conversation with an old friend?
Kind of both. I would have to wait because she would have to, wait to kind of translate. But I would just talk to Jason and say, hey, what was it like? Did you ever see, any of these bands, or did you see Yngwie when he first came over? Blah, blah, stuff like that. And then he would, communicate with his mom through his eyes, and then she would translate as you see in the movie. She translates his answers. And but
it's just amazing.
So but it was just like I'm thinking to myself, God damn, Jason hasn't changed a bit. It was just like me hanging out with him when he was still in Cacophony at 18, and just he still had the smile, he still had the enthusiasm, he still had the great sense of humor, and for him to still have that is just so inspiring.
That's amazing. And I got to ask you about Marty Friedman, since you helped get him the gig with Megadeth. It's interesting because he's not the original player, but when people and Megadeth had a lot of great guitar players, but most fans kind of Marty's the guy, as far as favorite Megadeth guitar player, and like everybody seems to love that era of Megadeth. Were you surprised when he left, or?
No, I kind of knew it was coming, and but you're right. Yeah, Rust in Peace was kind of a groundbreaking album for Megadeth. In fact, there's a great book that Dave Mustaine just put out all on Rust in Peace. And but Marty, was kind of getting tired of. Marty likes all different kinds of music. He was really getting infatuated with the Japanese music scene, and not just metal, but pop and everything.
That's what I was going to ask you, because over like the course
of started pretty early on, because he was kind of with Cacophony. Cacophony was huge in Japan. They love the guitar heroes. People like Paul Gilbert and Steve Vai, George Lynch, and Marty Friedman and Jason Becker. They were like huge names in Japan, just like these other guys. So it was a different scene than LA. So he was already huge in Japan before joining Megadeth.
Yeah, because what I think would be great to make a movie about someday is Marty Friedman, because the simple fact that over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, I know he's lived in Japan. He's like almost a pop icon figure in Japan. He's fluent in Japanese language, and he lives there. So it's just it's amazing that a guy like that could go over to Japan and kind of just reinvent himself, and he's just as popular.
Yeah, It's amazing what he's done, and he's loving that. So he's, he it was an obvious thing for him to. I mean, he had a plan together before he left Metallica. I think a lot of the other guys, like Sean Drover and Chris Broderick, they kind of left and they thought, oh, we're going to form a band, and but it wasn't. I don't think it was very planned out as much. Yeah. But Marty, Marty didn't lose a beat. He's probably bigger now than he was in Megadeth in Japan anyway.
And that's saying something.
He's a rock star. He's bigger than Megadeth.
I mean, I hear in Japan he's all over the TV and people know who he is.
Yeah, so. He has a TV celebrity. He's got everything going on. He writes for different major magazines out there. He had his own TV variety show. So he's like a huge celeb in Japan for the past several years. So he's doing what he wants to do, and man, you got to respect that. And that was always kind of his dream.
And we'll wrap it up with this. I mean, Bob, can you believe that just last week was 34 years since the passing of Cliff Burton?
Wow, I read that. I saw that like on Facebook or something. Yeah, that's pretty astonishing. I remember the day he passed away when I got the phone call, and when they were in Europe and Sweden in the bus accident, and it was just like, oh my God, this is devastating. And back then, Metallica were still. Master of Puppets had went platinum.
And you forget they were just...
but they were still kind of underground. It was,
you forget they had just done that tour with Ozzy, and then all that happened. Yeah.
I was at those shows,
Wow.
And, saw Cliff and saw him backstage after. And, it's just amazing to think 34 years. Crazy.
Well, Bob, I really enjoyed talking to you. I could talk to you all day, but obviously I won't because I know you're a busy man. But let's keep in touch, and anytime you have anything, like part 2 comes out or anything you want to talk about, I could talk to you all day about your movies and the metal scene. So let's keep in touch, okay?
Absolutely, and you got my number here.